Good morning, New Life Church. My name is Jim Stockdale. I'm one of the pastors here in the Conway campus. And today we're going to continue in our Life of David study as we look at 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 9. Just a very simple context before we dig into the passage. David now is a fugitive. David is on the run, fleeing for his life because Saul's jealousy has got the best of him. And all Saul wants to do is kill David. David is such a threat to the king. So David flees. And in verse 1, it says, David went to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. It's very interesting that David, in now, which is going to be a very difficult stage of his life, full of darkness, full of confusion, full of legitimate threats to his life, he instinctively goes to where he realizes he can get the most help. And symbolically, he is going to the presence of God. And I love what Matthew Henry says in his commentary. David, in distress, fled to the tabernacle of God. It's a great comfort in a day of trouble that we have a God to go to whom we may ask and expect direction. So David is a great example, and my main point this morning is simply about God is a God of provision. And David instinctively placed his trust in God. You may be in a situation today that is really difficult, maybe next to impossible. It may be a relational difficulty. It may be financial. It may be a health issue. It may be a mental, emotional, dark cloud that just will not disappear. But as David is an example for us, do we place our trust in God? Sometimes we have to admit that we forget that the first place to turn is God. Sadly, instead of trusting God, we'll turn to another person, we'll turn to ourselves, we'll turn to an addiction, we'll turn to food, we'll turn to Netflix, we'll turn to what the culture says, we'll just withdraw into self-pity and just stop. But David instinctively trusts God for provision. And then as he gets in God's presence, as he interacts with the priest is used by God to provide him a very special, simple need that David had. David is hungry, and he ends up from the priest getting 5 loaves of bread, and this is special bread that only the priest is supposed to eat. That's a whole nother study. But the priest realizes that it's okay to break the rules, break the tradition related to the Sabbath, and let David have this bread for the nourishment that he needs. This story is even highlighted in some of Jesus' teaching as he later on will use this story as an example about God and the Sabbath and how to relate appropriately to people and obey the Sabbath and love your neighbor. That's a whole nother devotional. But David realizes God is a great provider, because as he gets in God's presence, he also learns of God's perspective. And in our busy life, we have to intentionally take time to get in God's presence. And that's different ways, different forms for how we are designed by God to get in his presence. It might be in corporate worship. It might be in private worship. It might just a time of solitude. It may be in your own prayer closet or your own prayer time. It's in your quiet time as you're seeking God's perspective through his word. And the more and more I get in God's word, his love letter to us, we recognize God's perspective. No matter what the situation, God is always with us. Jesus promised this in Matthew 28. He said, I've got to go away, but as I go away, I'm going to give you my Spirit, who will be your comforter, to be your advocate, be your guide, be your helper, be your friend. And I will always be with you. So part of the perspective in that circumstance, as we recognize God's provision, one, he's always with us, he cares for us, he loves us, and he provides for us in his own way. And then not only does he provide for us, he also allows us to remember his faithfulness. I love it in this story in verse 8. David is asking the priest if there is a spear or a sword that he can take. As he continues on the run, he needs to be armed. And then the priest in verse 9 reminds him the only weapon available here is the sword of Goliath, the great giant that you killed. So David takes that sword to arm himself, the sword of Goliath. And I just can't help but believe the moment David remembered this was the sword of Goliath, he instinctively remembered God's faithfulness. Not only provision and protection, he just realized and reminded himself, God is a faithful God. So sometime today, I want you to just take some time to remind yourself of times where God provided or protected. Just think back over your life. Make a list of these. Maybe share them with your spouse or your family later today, maybe with your friends. Just take the time today to ask God to remind you of times of his provision and protection.